Hey guys, how's it going? I'm Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi music YouTuber, and we are back again with the potential plosives. I'm hoping not. I do have my pop protector on with what else? But the second part of the Swans discography review, a massive discography. Today we're going to be covering what I am referring to as the next era of Swans. They've got many of these things, so be patient. If you're waiting for the Trinity, we got 30 years, almost 30 years to go, because we're taking our sweet time and really enjoying the things that we have, because I feel like not a lot of people actually know about this area, because of course we were talking about the money era, or the public castration is a good idea era, which is probably the best way to describe it, because that's probably the most influential and popular thing that came out of this time. But at first, we got to talk about the things that sort of went into doing that. Of course, hot takes are welcome in this series. I'm never going to lie to you guys. I might embellish for dramatic effect, but the rating stands true at the end. And we're going to start with what many people actually believe to be the very worst Swans album from 1986. This is Greed. Now, if you know anything about Greed and Holy Money, you'd probably look at this album cover and you're like, wow, two peas in a pod must be very, very similar. And yeah, I could say a lot of things about either album that is a lot about the other two. And if you were following along correctly with the series, diligently doing your listening, and you would probably think, well, Filth and Cop sound pretty similar. No, not like this. These two are very similar. In fact, people's arguing about the quality of either one goes sort of between two routes. It's either Holy Money is a more developed version of Greed and therefore better, or they're so similar and Greed did it first, so Greed's better. You will come to find I am of the latter opinion. I also don't think Holy Money develops that much on top of this, but of course first we are talking about Greed. But these are both so similar, they're both the first time we see Jarboe here, so I could also kind of describe this as the sort of early Jarboe era. She's here barely. She's not even doing lead vocals on a track yet until at least Holy Money. And then, we reach the later albums where she's just full speed ahead. But right now, she's here to add textural, ghostly support, which is honestly why we're going to see Public Castration is a good idea be so effective. Not the only reason, but many of the reasons. And we open up with a huge, huge deviation from the Swan sound here with the track Fool, which is a way, way, way less abrasive version of Swans. You have Michael Gira doing as close to singing as he's gotten so far. Of course, he'll get way closer to actual singing, but here you have actual piano underneath the whole thing, and pretty much only piano. Really interesting opening just from the get-go, and you've got these really just self-loathing lyrics here. You'll see some similar themes from albums like Cop, because this is about having a false self that you're not sure how to fix and pushing on either way. It's a really dark and really interesting idea about exploring the self, but I guess, it is Swans, it is early Swans, so it's probably about being locked into capitalism and just being unable to really find yourself, and instead you're just under a yoke. I would argue that the song runs a tiny bit long, but it's so ominous that in a slightly more vicarious listening point, it will be super atmospheric and super interesting. I'm sure in the right mindset, this would fit perfectly, and it's a very solid intro. And up next is the song Anything For You, which is much more familiar. Sounds more like Filth, sounds more like Cops, sounds more like anything from the previous era, but it feels a lot more organic. It's no longer as purely noisy. Of course, you are going to get like one groove that is just revolving over itself. It feels like a rotating, cranking machine, but it feels and sounds less mechanical, and at least less harshly like metal hitting on metal mechanical. There are points on this album that sounds like straight up machinery in terms of its repetition and clickiness, but here it is a bit more musical, a bit more gothic, some people even claim. It is a very, very good example of the classic two-chord structure for a song they will use forever. But it is very haunting. It is very layered over itself. It reminds me a lot of Halber Mensch, the song by Einstürzen Neubauten. It has this apocalyptically huge kick drum track that is filled with so much reverb that it provides the entire energy that propels this track forward. The imagery is pure pain, and it is following a similar lyrical approach as all these previous albums, as having very, very simple lyrics, almost being sort of more immersive in a alien perspective. Solid track. This goes into the track Nobody, which is a drone fest if I've ever heard one, and our first actual appearance of one Jarboe. Yes, one of the most iconic Swans members ever. Many could claim probably the second most iconic Swans member, because she will be in Swans up until they break up in like 2001, as far as I remember. I don't know, it was probably like a little bit earlier, but I haven't gotten to that point, so I don't have to be that accurate about it. But her vocals here don't really come across like you'd expect. They are actually just backing vocals, and it's not really what you'd think. It's actually used as like an extra melody line that is thrown through all these weird analog effects of the time, but it doesn't sound cheap or used improperly or like before its time in a way that was sort of harming the sound. It sounds like it's coming through the wall. It is truly haunting. And you'll hear that on this and the next album. In combination with the guitar hits, this track feels like straight morphine. It has an almost choral, religious seeming pace to the track, like a dirge of some sort. It has what I think to be a really cool set of themes for this and the next album, a lot of religious iconography here. It has a contrast between self-destruction and a higher power. It's like sacrificing yourself for a god, but in a way that is so instantaneous and personal and personally self-destructive, which goes into the track Stupid Child. It's actually decently fast compared to every other song they've had on this album. So you've got these really, really heavy percussive hits that contrast really heavily with, right after this, really minimalist clicking sound, which it shows one of the hidden strengths of Swans, that stark, huge dynamic contrast. Well, normally they do it with straight silence. Having more minimalist textures like this is one of their strongest elements in their entire arsenal, and they don't use it as much as they could. The layered vocals are warping in and out of reality, and they are super creepy. And they also sound completely dejected and apathetic and just horrible. The lyrical content on this album has also been completely consistent up to this point, with just sheer self-hatred, which is weird because the album's called Greed. You don't get a whole lot of direct information or perspective about the concept of greed, unless it's comparing it in some abstract way to like religion and self-hatred and capitalism. Cop was a little bit more clear about that. And of course we go into the title track now, Greed, which features another classic Jarboe vocal line, haunting, ghostly, even hostile this time around, but ultimately not that different from the last time we've heard it. Lyrically, it's honestly a little bit lacking. It's just not poignant enough. But if this song does have anything, it's that it's so very much off kilter. The way the guitar just wobbles through the whole thing, it's just really, really croaking and gross. Then we reach one of my favorite tracks, known as Heaven, which is the most melodic track so far, and it features these awesome drony vocals. And you've got this really interesting descending guitar line that is intercut with these giant drum hits. Another instance of the contrast being super impactful. This is a song that feels distinctly powerful for this album. It's really scary, and especially how Jira's vocals go from this sort of apathetic, sort of nervous sound to something screaming and completely manic. The religious imagery here is as disturbing as it will get. And this goes into the final track on the album, Money is Flesh, which has this very weird stitched together loop of various textures. The snare hits so hard compared to the rest of the track, it genuinely feels like a march. And I have no idea what the texture is here, but I would describe it almost like a bagpipe, or like a really old, like historical, like Bronze Age era horn of some sort. Not like a war horn, but like a brass horn. It's really harsh and weird, and it sounds really, it's really even hard to explain, except it's just super unnerving. Every time it hits in the track, it manages to scare me. The drums do speed up with this really interesting tribal rhythm, which sounds super intense, which I like a lot. And that is actually the entire album. It is actually one of the most alien sounding albums you'll ever hear, because the harshness contrasts so interestingly with the more lighter textures here that it's just hard to really pin down. It's almost like it's trying to tell you something that the album isn't at all portraying. It's like it's uncomfortable on accident, like purely on accident, but it's just consistent over the entire time. It's so foreign and weird. It's a really effective atmosphere. It's one of the most immersive albums you'll hear in a long time. It is a bit uninspired at points, but other than that, I think it's actually really cool. I feel like giving this one a low iFunny. Maybe not every track sounds different enough. There are certainly highlights on here, like the opening track, Heaven, especially the lyrics on Nobody. Those are some that I'll be looking at for a long, long time. But I thought this one was okay. A lot of people hate it. Apologies for probably an abrupt change in tone of voice and a little cut that is unnoticeable due to the editing process of this video. My Airbnb neighbors were wildin'. I had to talk to them. But you know, what's better to think about the flaws of modern society than early Swans? And before we go any further, I'm going to discuss very briefly the single EP, the Time Is Money Bastard single, if you want to call it one of those things. It only has 2 songs on it, so it's pretty simple. Which the Time Is Money Bastard track, it actually is referenced on Greed, but here it sounds almost like EBM, the way it is so distinctly mechanical. And in this way, it feels much more hostile, but also in this way, it feels like it is less distinguished from their contemporaries at the time. You know, they sound plenty like any other EBM band, but Michael Gira's voice is a little bit more overbearing. And the other song is called Sealed in Skin, which feels like a song title-wise would really take off, which is kind of an unremarkable track, but it has more piano in the background, which I think sounds really, really good. Generally not 2 essential tracks at all. If you want to be... here's another thing about Swans. I'll just dive into this real quickly. Live material, they'll just never repeat any of it. They do a tour and they switch it all up entirely. They haven't done I Crawled in about like a decade, but they used to do it all the time. And it used to be considered a classic Swans track. That's just simply not the case anymore, as classic Swans doesn't really exist. It's always a new iteration. Every new album feels like a new thing. Back in the day, maybe things felt a little bit different, but this, of all things, is inessential. So in a way, everything is inessential except for the most current album, and if that's not the best, then it's hard to even to define. So in a way, it's all essential. Either way, it's okay material. It's just not something I really care to listen to again. So up next we have the Holy Money album, which is pretty clearly from the same recording sessions as Greed. You have a lot of the same stuff going on. In fact, you even have the titular Money Is Flesh track re-recorded. It's called Money Is Flesh number 2, and you have another track that does the same thing. But here you begin with a track called A Hanging, which might be the strongest track on the album, specifically for its subject matter. It has a lot of the same stuff as Greed. This is another track that has Jarboe on it. It's got the ghostly backing stuff. It certainly sounds good. It's nothing new. It is honestly even darker. It feels like it has gotten one step deeper into the abstract and weird, especially lyrically. And the piano on this track is actually sort of incorporated with other elements, so when it eventually drops off, you only hear bass, the kick drum, and the vocals remaining, which is really haunting. As much as a presence can be haunting, it shows that a lack of a presence could be just as haunting, maybe even more. And this goes into the track You Need Me, which is the first track that has actual Jarboe singing. It is a piano ballad with Jarboe singing much more melodically than Michael Gira, and in a way it reminds me a lot of Not Available by The Residents, with this sort of decrepit, dilapidated feeling to the whole thing. It feels sad and horrifying. It is less than 2 minutes long, but it is just so strictly ghostly. It's actually one of my favorite moments on the whole album. And this goes into Fool number 2, and if you've been watching this video, you might know that Fool is a song off of Greed. This is the exact same song with an updated sound palette. The piano is still there, but this also has pretty much the rest of the band filling in all the space. Probably the coolest element here is the giant guitar, which sounds kind of like Heaven off of Greed, which I think is a really, really cool texture. But overall, I prefer the original, having just the lone piano. It's a really cool contrast with the rest of the album. And up next is A Screw, Holy Money, which is a track that totally deviates in terms of theme, as this one is about a sex worker, and the lyrics are just telling a person what to do, and you just feel so vile listening to this one. It's really not fun to listen to, and it's finally something that comes into the themes of capitalism of this album, because it really hasn't been touched upon as much as you think it would. Not that that's a legitimate complaint out of me, because even though I'm misled a little bit, I'm not really disappointed by that in particular. I'm more disappointed by the lack of ingenuity between these two albums. I am totally fine with it, and it being here almost is like a weird contrast coming back into reality, which I'm kind of mixed on. I mean, I like the thematic consistency of Greed a lot. Holy Money, deviating from that a little bit, doesn't do a lot for me. It is oppressive, it is certainly repetitive, but it kind of lacks the power you might hear on something like on, say, Filth. the Young God EP in particular, but like it's a very cool song. It's one that they've brought back over the next couple years in their live lineups. It's certainly a cool one. Thematically, it's huge, and Michael Giro's lyrics about it really portray a different side to his delivery, but musically, it just does so little different that I can't even really tell. Like, that's just a thought that I thought way later after listening to the track. And this goes into the song known as Another You, which is a legitimate highlight off the album. It is slow, grimy, and dirty. It sounds like something off of Cop with a serious textural update. You've got much more instrumentation here. The guitar sounds a little bit more melodic, whatever that means. It is a song that is really cool as it's about wanting to be hurt, which does lack a bit of immediacy in its pacing. And the mix kind of cuts off the ends of it as well. It's sort of in this weird middling area between like lo-fi and clean for the time, and it's kind of struggling as a result. And this goes into the Money is Flesh number 2. It is the same song off of Greed. I can't tell that much of a difference. It might be a bit thicker, probably a bit longer in all honesty, but I couldn't tell much of a difference with my listening, so I just kind of not much point in really mentioning it. And that's kind of the biggest problem with this thing as an album. Even like you could claim it's like, wow, they really made it so similar to Greed. It's like, no, they took 2 of the songs off of Greed and gave them a slight improvement, if you want to call it that, and they did the rest of it as an album, and it's like not even breaking 40 minutes for a band that can repeat as long as they want to. And sometimes it works. I'll show you guys when it works. And then this goes into the amazing track Coward, probably my favorite track on the album. It has crystal clear spoken word. It's over a killer mechanical sound. It is super unnerving, and all the lyrics dive into the super self-deprecating state. It's really weird as a closing track in all honesty, but just referring to himself as a coward over and over again, with the contrast of the more EBM structure to this thing, is really, really bizarre. Total different direction for Swans in a way, even though it's still repetitive, still oppressive, themes are still the same. It's just, they're just kind of breaking new edge a little bit. I wouldn't have done it as an outro. I feel like it could have worked as an intro in all honesty, but I mean, I'll take it where it is. I give this one a low Weezer, and even sometimes I feel like that's a little bit too high. It's just, I think this is one of the weakest Swans albums. It's probably bottom 3 for sure. Just not enough ideas. As a standalone album, it's probably a similar rating in all honesty. It's like the tracks don't hit the same as they do on Greed, because the way they're portrayed on Greed, I think, is better. And that's controversial to some people, but I don't really get it. And the next thing I'll be discussing just a little bit is the A Screw EP, which was released a few months later the same year. Kind of just the cutting room floor of these 2 albums, but in all honesty, it's not that bad when talking about this previous material. I think it's actually decently solid. So at first, the track is A Screw Holy Money, which is another version of Holy Money. It's basically Holy Money 2, except this version is actually taken in a really interesting route. It's given a few extra minutes, and it's given this crushing saxophone. Like if you remember from my first video, we discussed a little bit about Swans' EP with the saxophone just whirling off in this direction. Now imagine if you took that, and instead of it being this short little rhythmic bursts, you just had it just crushing it the whole time. Super abrasive, not even fun to listen to, and you had it just going and going and going and going and going. And honestly, I don't hate it at all. I think it's an interesting version. I could see going with either one, either way. I love the callback to the original Swans material. I think it's really cool. It's still kind of EBM. It's very rhythmic. It's grimy. Really not like a shock for Swans era, but like out of the blue, of course, it seems super unnerving and shocking. I would say it's inessential, even though it is a great interpretation, though. And the other track here is Blackmail, which shows up on the Children of God album, which I will not be reviewing today, but that is the next full-length album by Swans, so get ready to hear about Blackmail. It's a song with piano and Jarboe singing. It's really interesting. And then to complete the single, there is a version of A Screw that is just instrumental. Honestly, I didn't even care to listen to it. I can hear plenty of the instrumental on both versions of the tracks. It's cool. So I can't really give a full review for that single, but it's a good little bits of extra stuff. But there is one thing I'm going to cover to finish off this video. Something I don't think I've covered this type of release before on this channel. I hope to cover plenty more in the future, not just in this series, because believe me, in this series you'll hear about it plenty of times, but I want to just cover more of this stuff in the future because I think it's a really, really interesting art form just in general in terms of music. Live albums, this one being Public Castration is a Good Idea. First of all, insane title. So if you've heard the rumors about this live album, they're certainly not unjustified. This thing is a beast. It is very harsh, very crushing, and the track list only consists of tracks from Greed and Holy Money. It doesn't deviate at all. And if you want to hear some live material of the earlier Swans albums, they have it on bonus tracks. They have it on little outtake albums, which hopefully I'll be able to cover at some point, but the discography is just so freaking massive. It's hard to even remember all the things they have. Looking through their Rate Your Music page, and it's like, oh, suddenly this new thing shows up, some outtakes album, and it's actually historically relevant to the band. It's hard to sort of track everything. But Public Castration is a Good Idea is by far the best version to listen to either of the past albums I've discussed. It doesn't contain every track off both albums, but it contains a longer length than both of those albums combined. And testing it with a slightly more vicarious listen, you can tell that that is the preferred way to listen to it. Now, Swans, what they would do for this and the next few years is their live albums would sound entirely lo-fi. Not so lo-fi that you can't tell what's going on, but lo-fi enough where you can certainly tell. You can't really even tell what Michael Gira is singing. But what's crazy is you can hear Jarboe singing in the background, which she's not singing any actual words, but Michael Gira is singing actual words, and you don't know what they are. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter at all. It's his attitude that's the whole thing. I could talk for a long time about the sheer heaviness of this live album, but I'll be trying my best to condense it to the points where it actually pushes it ahead of other things you might hear, because they don't show a lot of contrast here. It's sort of constantly that giant, really heavy sound between cuts of that and silence, and not a lot of other textures. The bass is back to what it was on something like Young God or Cop. It's as atonal as it's ever sounded, and yet it is still the Greed and Holy Money tracks. It doesn't sound as lively as they were on those tracks. In fact, it sounds much heavier, and yet it sounds distinct enough where you can't mistake it as the Cop or Young God tracks, oddly enough. All of these tracks were recorded in some random New York clubs, but the reverb in these things is just insane. It's almost intoxicating and hypnotic, and somehow you get all these track lengths to almost all of these tracks to be double, and yet it's still engaging the whole time through. It is just filthy, and a lot of the nuance, in all honesty, of Greed and Holy Money are lost on these live renditions, but it doesn't even matter. There's no way to tell if there's guitar on the track Stupid Child, simply because it is so swamped in noise. And if I remember correctly, it is that track that is maybe my favorite due to its live setting, because in all these live Swans albums, they don't shy away from recording the whole sound of the place, kind of like Throbbing Gristle would do in all their live albums in the late 80s, if I remember correctly. But you hear this one guy in the audience, he's probably drunk. I mean, I know how I've been drunk at shows at points, and he's just like, no one beats you like a cop, as was done on the track Cop off of Cop. So he does it one more time, no one beats you like a cop. And then immediately after, the bass of Swans just crushes the whole mix. You can tell these microphones just condensed the whole thing. Everything's compressed to hell just right after he says those things. And it's almost like telling this guy, it's like, you don't mean a word you're saying, and we're about to prove it to you. Which Swan's ethos like that has always really resonated with me as an artist. Probably the best track here, and maybe even the most different to its original version, is Another You, because it starts and it is so loud that it actually hurts to listen to. It is so swamped in noise that I couldn't pick out a single discernible detail for the first couple of minutes, until rising out of the ether, out of the primordial ooze and the sludge that Swans have laid out in this thing, you hear some actual discernible texture. And the songs don't even feel any different. It just sounds like pain. It sounds like hell. It's horrible. And in that way, it is absolutely amazing. Such an interesting album cycle, real quick. Greed and Holy Money being both the most overlooked early Swans material and some of the most overlooked Swans material in the entire catalog, and yet their first live album ever is just crazy sounding. It's just punishing. And it doesn't even stop with that one, because we're going to go into future live albums, and man, Swans is a live band, which is crazy to think about. After seeing them live, it's just, seeing them live is the best way to do anything. Anything at all that you can do is to see Swans live. But that's really all I'm reviewing for you guys today. Just a couple full-length albums, a couple singles, and a live album. Next time we'll be going into their sort of intermediary gothic period, which I think is kind of fun. And I hope to see you guys there. I would love to hear your comments, questions, concerns in the comments down below, as well as a like and a subscribe, which would help my channel out quite a bit. If you're interested in following more of my social media to see what else I'm up to, you know, my Instagram and Twitter, or X, I guess, are in the description down below, as well as my Discord, which I actually probably post on the most. Recently been posting about some CDs I've been purchasing. Really excited to receive those soon. Discogs is burning away at my bank account. Don't tell my financial advisor, but we'll see how that goes. And other than that, I hope to see you guys next time. Hope you guys are having a good day out there. Have a good one. Bye.